Superstitious Ignorance by Michael Cornish. Read by Huw Carr. Edward tapped his gloved fingers on the leather-covered steering wheel. He stared through the glistening windscreen at the sheen on the bonnet, then at the square houses running away in the half-darkness of the seedy street beyond. The squat bonnet gleamed with 20th century superiority over the peeled and grimy facades of the 18th century villas to either side of the street. Their decayed facades were too ingrained with grime to benefit from the charm of the gaslight. The original Victorian gaslights had survived in that area, which was usually as flattering to such architecture as nightclub light to female complexion. "Georgian, I'd say," Edward said. "Definitely Georgian." His wife, Penny, stirred beside him in the passenger seat. The big collar of her fawn cashmere coat was turned up, and it pushed out her honey-blonde hair a little, but attractively, nevertheless. Looking attractive was quite natural to her, and not something studied. The coat, which she had been able to buy at a knockdown price from the people she'd modelled it for, looked marvellous against the black leather upholstery of the Mini Cooper. "Yes," Penny said, "but my God, look at it." "Oh, do try to use your imagination, darling," Edward said excitedly. "Just think, a detached Georgian house with a large garden at the back, 8 big rooms and hall. Think of what we can make with it." Penny pulled her coat tightly about her, which he resented a little because there was an excellent heater in the car, until he recognized that it was an instinctive defensive measure against coming to this down-at-hill area at all. He knew very well in his heart she'd be happy to spend all her life in flats in Chelsea, flittering away their modest lump of capital, and that it was only her determination to be a good wife that had steeled her to coming with him in the first place. "I didn't like that estate agent, darling," Penny said nervously. "He did seem so shifty and vague, too. And such a seedy little office." Edward laughed indulgently. It made him both exasperated and affectionate to remember that she was still a sucker for any smart exterior, though he'd been quietly trying to open her eyes to the real world for all of the 18 months he'd known her. "Oh, come now, Penny, my love. He was quite a nice man, really. Quite a sense of humour if you'd listened for it. Did you hear how he described negotiating with the little people who own properties in this area? Like dealing with a tank full of eels, he said." He saw she wasn't ready to be cajoled out of her nervousness, and put his arm round her. "Now, darling, just this one house tonight. It shouldn't take more than half an hour. Then we can go back. And seeing that it's Friday night, I'll take you to dinner at the Roman Room. There, what about that?" She turned her face to him. Her eyes showed a mixture of contrition and delight now that he'd mentioned her favourite place. He kept on smiling, though deep down he was a bit irritated with her for making him resort to such extravagant bribery. "Besides," he said, "it's just because the estate agent's so clueless that he hasn't seen the potential of this area yet. It stands to reason areas like this, only 3 or 4 stops from the Tube in the West End, must come up. People can't go on paying more and more astronomical prices for houses around the smarter areas, and the rail fares and so on are already driving the long-distance commuters back into town." He knew it was all so much repetition, but it seemed to be the only way to do it. "And what's more, Penny, remember those houses that have been done up so nicely in the terrace just back around the corner? It's already happening, you see. We just can't afford to miss a chance like this. We'd kick ourselves forever if we did." Just for a moment, he saw in his mind's eye the house as it might be. The stucco restored round the windows, and the classic door, The door itself could be in natural wood, with coach lamps setting off its delicate, balanced grace. Penny, in her very latest evening gown, she'd surely pick up something just right from her modelling, as she always did, in the doorway welcoming the astonished and admiring first-comers to their housewarming. Penny smiled the sweetest of her private smiles for him, and he knew the enthusiasm that had been in his voice had rekindled her support. "Oh, Teddy, darling, I know you're right. It's just me again. You know you're not to mind." He kissed her tenderly, and then opened the door and got out to make the most of it before her mood faltered. He took his big torch out of the side pocket in the door, just in case, and then went round to help her out. He shut the door after her briskly, enjoying again the solid musical clunk as the well-made panel fitted as smoothly into place as a folded wing to a falcon's back. The sound of their feet on the road, then on the pavement, then on the 5 shallow steps to the front entrance to the house, were the only noises to be heard in the quiet and deserted street. Only the light shining dimly here and there through the cheap curtains in the windows of some of the houses, and the old second-hand cars parked intermittently along the roadside, showed that the area was inhabited at all. The porch light was broken, of course, so the elegant shape of the stucco beneath its peeling, sooty surface paint offered only a sense of desolation and unwelcome now as he groped about with gloved fingers and eyes for signs of a bell. Eventually, he found it and pressed it. There was no answering noise from inside, no sound at all. Penny's patent leather high heels stood glistening as she moved her feet apprehensively to a new position. "It's extraordinary, though, that it should be going so cheap, if it's as much of a find as you say," she said quietly, as though someone might be listening. "It does seem, well, fishy." He laughed briskly, establishing the masculine no-nonsense note on which they had to see the thing through. He found the door knocker, obviously a pleasing bit of brass beneath these caked layers of ancient black paint, and banged it sharply several times. "Do you think anyone's there?" Penny said. "I don't think the place is occupied after all." "Of course there's someone there. The estate agent said there is a sitting tenant, and sitting tenants don't run out unless there's a very good reason. A woman, I think he said, with kids." There was no sound from inside. "The point is, Penny darling, for £3,000 this place is a snip, sitting tenant or no sitting tenant. Besides, I'm sure we can winkle her out in no time if we pay her a few hundred to move. And we'll easily be able to do that if we can get this for only 3,000. At that moment, there was a startling grinding of bolts behind the door, and it swung open to present them with a gust of moist and fetid air that was obviously being changed for the first time in months, and a small, squat woman in an unspeakably filthy apron. Her face was primitive and olive-skinned. Her eyes, so far as Edward could tell in the miserable light of the 30-watt bulb in the hall behind her, were dark and hot with an unfathomable mixture of suspicion, hostility, and imperviousness. Her hair was black and parted in the middle, then heaped up in an untidy bun at the back of her head. It looked as if it had never been washed, ever. "Good evening," Edward said firmly in his best junior management tone. "Mrs. Laristi?" The woman didn't reply. She watched them as though they were some sort of distant passing show. "My name's Grafton. This is my wife. I hope Mr. Faithwell at the estate agent told you we were coming round tonight to look at the house. I gather you know that it's up for sale." Mrs. Laristi spoke at last in a deep, hoarse voice. "Mr. Faithwell, yes. He's been here some time. 2 weeks ago, maybe. This is something or other. I don't know." She shrugged, pulling her lips down at the corners. He decided a firm lead would be the thing to make up for Faithwell's inefficiency. There was no point in letting it go now, as it would be no end of a job getting Penny back there another time. He stepped into the hall past the woman, smiling politely but firmly, and saying, "Well, we'll be very quick, I promise you, Mrs. Laristi. We'll disturb you as little as possible." It was then that he noticed the string of kids standing silently behind her. There were 4 of them, and they were all disgustingly filthy. Some had their fingers stuffed in their messy mouths. Some worked nervously at the dirty garments at their groins. All stared at him and Penny with their mother's dark-eyed, complex stare. He took Penny's arm in his to show their solidarity, and looked round the hall, taking in as much as the great plague of shadows left by the 30-watt bulb would allow. The hall was beautifully proportioned, and focused naturally on the swing of the staircase at the end, in spite of the peeling wallpaper and the hideously blistered and ancient green paint all over the place. The floor was well laid and seemed sound.
"It's no good, this house,"
Mrs. Laristi said. She shook her head.
"Bad spirits."
"Bad spirits?" Penny repeated, then blinked at Edward for support. "I think we'll look in this room first," Edward said dismissively, for answer to both of them. Somehow the Laristi brood infiltrated past him to stand in a body in front of the door.
"It's our room," Mrs. Laristi said. "It's for us, for living. It's private."
"Look," Edward said reassuringly. "We won't steal anything or even touch anything. We only want a quick look to see the shape of the room and whether it's structurally okay. You must be sensible, Mrs. Laristi. The more fuss you make, the longer it'll take, and the longer we'll be here." Mrs. Laristi watched him for a moment and then shrugged and opened the door, then switched on the dim light. She'd been telling the truth. What had presumably once been the kitchen for the whole house was the only room the family apparently used. The old-fashioned iron range, built into the wall around the fireplace, was in a state of unutterable squalor. The room stank bitterly of urine and filth. There was one massive bed in which presumably all of them slept, with soiled bedclothes grey and shiny with dirt heaped on it. Clothes and papers and empty and half-empty food containers lay heaped in what remaining space there was. 2 cheap wooden chairs were the only other pieces of furniture in the room. 3 or 4 mangy, fox-faced cats suddenly shot out from under the bed and out between his legs to disappear somewhere into the house. "Yes," Edward said. "Thank you, I think we've seen enough of that room." "Oh, it's becoming a little more obvious why it's only 3,000, Penny muttered to him breathlessly. She'd been holding her breath in Mrs. Laristi's room. Edward walked across the other side of the hall and reached for the handle of the nearest room, glad that he had kept his gloves on, and thinking that there was no future in paying too much deference to the woman, because she didn't own the place anyway. But Mrs. Laristi suddenly moved with unexpected speed to push past in front of him, reeking of old cooking grease and bodily staleness.
"Ah, Dios, wait, for other rooms first, it must be done. It must be done."
She rolled her eyes upwards, crossed herself and muttered on, while she went through a series of genuflections, and then some weird and distinctly pagan-looking gestures in front of the door. To Edward's amazement, all the children imitated her movement, as best they could, behind her. "How depressing," Penny said weakly beside him. She had turned her head a little so that her nose was against the big turned-up cashmere collar. He squeezed her waist to reassure her. When she had finished, Mrs. Laristi opened the door fearfully and peered hesitantly beyond it, as though it might at any moment be necessary to bolt. Edward stepped in after her and switched on the light, which once again proved to be a bare 30-watt bulb. There was nothing unpleasant to see in the room beyond its dirtiness. Otherwise, it wasn't even used now, and it stank of cats. Otherwise, there were some old and rotted armchairs, a bare iron bed frame, and a lot of old newspapers and magazines, and empty cans scattered about. Presumably, when the chaos became too much in her room, she simply shifted the excess in here. Edward made himself miss all this and see the potential of the beautiful casement windows at either end. Above, he saw to his delight there was a fine moulded ceiling that certainly looked as though it was the work of real craftsmen and was more or less intact, apart from the dirt. There was a sort of arch in the middle of the room to indicate that it could be used as two if necessary, and fine wood fireplace surrounds in each section. His heart leaped with new resolution about the house as he went out. "Yes," he said, rubbing his gloved hands together. "And now let's move on. Shall we see the room opposite?" Mrs. Laristi burst into speech again.
This house no good, not glad. It's the evil presences. It's old evil thing. Maybe murder, I don't know. Very evil things in there. No good for you.
"I'm afraid ghosts are allergic to me," he said, enjoying his archness the more because he knew it would be meaningless to her. "They just vanish away wherever I go." Mrs. Laristi looked at him suspiciously and sniffed. Edward said, "Now I think we'll have a look in this room opposite." He moved to the door on the opposite side of the hall, but once again Mrs. Laristi and her troop of silent children sprang ahead of him and went through their weird and muddled ritual. "Oh, Teddy, darling, I don't like this. It's so strange. What are they doing?" "Oh, don't take any notice of the silly old troll. She thinks going through all this corny mumbo-jumbo is going to frighten us off the house. Really, I ask you, it's too absurd for words. It makes you want to laugh out loud." Mrs. Laristi had stopped now and looked round at them with hostility, suspicious about their whispering. From her face it looked as though she thought they were planning to murder her. "What nice children you have, Mrs. Laristi," Penny said reassuringly. "It must be so jolly, all being together in a group like that. So nice for playing." She produced a semblance of her social laugh, and Edward squeezed her hand in gratitude for the effort she had made. Mrs. Laristi looked at her children as though Penny had reminded her of an enemy. She turned on the children suddenly and began shouting at the youngest and hitting him for no apparent reason. The child immediately started to scream, and then one of the older children began to attack its mother. She turned on it, too, with gusto, until she had eventually subdued them both. Penny put her hand behind Edward's arm, and they watched with more disgust than embarrassment this flurry of near-animal turmoil. When it was over, Edward opened the door and strode firmly into the room. The light didn't work, and he had to use his torch. This room was completely bare and had only one casement window. It didn't run the whole length of the house like the room opposite. The air in it was damp and clammy with cold. There was a strange smell about that wasn't quite so recognizable this time. There was something more to it than just dirt and staleness and cats, something familiar and rather disturbing. Not quite drains or mustiness, something else. "What's that funny smell, Penny, darling?" But Penny had taken out the little handkerchief soaked in Worth perfume she kept in her handbag and was dabbing it to her nose, so presumably she had managed to avoid it altogether. Edward walked across the room, puzzling over the smell, listening to his feet echoing on the boards. He pulled absent-mindedly at a piece of peeled wallpaper exposed by the steely finger of light from his torch. Still, the smell meant nothing to him.
"Now upstairs,"
Mrs. Laristi said, pressing them with sudden vigor.
"Many rooms upstairs."
They trooped up the bare, shadowy stairs, which pirouetted round to face a narrow landing. The landing was in complete darkness. Edward switched on his torch and swung it about. There seemed to be a rather nice panelling in the form of a dado on both walls, although it was of course ruined at present by countless layers of horrible old paint. Possibly that might have saved it from the worm, though. That was a consoling thought worth remembering. "Of course," he said to Penny in a strong conversational tone. "You have to remember this area was something of a little health spa right outside the city of London when all these nice houses were built. That accounts for the expensive and tasteful workmanship. This house probably belonged to a rich merchant, probably his little showpiece in the country. It seems odd to think of it like that now, doesn't it?"
"These are rooms," Mrs. Laristi said. "Bad rooms. Cold and not good. You wait for me to make it done for you to go in."
She and her children then went into her ritual once again, before she would let any of them into the rooms. Edward found, to his intense irritation, that his common sense was being eroded slowly by the repetition of her muddled yet strangely disturbing performance. The inept support from her children added to its macabre effect now, instead of making it more ridiculous, as he had expected. He began to feel uneasy, and this made him furious with her, and all the more determined to overcome the puerile weakness in him that was susceptible to such rubbish. The rooms he went into with Penny were not in so bad a state as those downstairs, though they too were suffering from long neglect. They were all completely empty, and had obviously not even been entered, let alone used, more than once or twice in decades. The ancient and filthy wallpaper had not been changed since Victorian times. There were thick layers of dirt on the pleasantly shaped windows, some of which had broken panes and pieces of wood tacked over them. The two rooms, which had been the principal bedrooms, had excellent ceilings in the same style as the downstairs main rooms, and really attractive fireplace surrounds disfigured by chocolate paint. As far as he could tell from the beam of his torch, none of the lights were working, of course. There were no telltale signs of a leaky roof above the ceilings either. "There's something eerie about these rooms," Penny muttered. "They're so deserted. It's as though as much living as ought to be done in them has been done already. They're, sort of empty tombs, aren't they?" "Oh, don't be silly," he said shortly, because something of the same feeling had come to him, simply as a result of the Laristis' repeated absurdities he knew very well. All houses are like this before anything's been done to them. You've got to look at them with what can be done in your mind, not just take them as they are. She didn't reply, and he knew he had upset her, but he hardened himself against it. Everything he had seen so far had confirmed the potential of the place, and he damned well wasn't going to be jockeyed out of it by female pressure, even if Penny's was being added to the Laristi woman's for the time being. He'd soon shake her out of that when he got her to the Roman room.
"Is it evil, this house?"
Mrs. Laristi chose the moment to chip in again, watching him with her black eyes, which looked in the gloom out of the landing like the source of all the darkness in the house.
"Sometimes,"
she said,
"these terrible cries and the shrieks, these horror that frighten my little ones so they cannot sleep or eat for days. They sick for days."
"Oh, for God's sake, that's enough of this drivel," Edward burst out. "We've had quite enough ignorance and folly for now. What kind of fools do you think we are? We're not taken in by that sort of thing, don't you see? If we'd like the house, we'll buy it, whatever you say, and we'll probably even give you a whole lot of money to find somewhere else to live you'll like better. Now let us see the rest of it without any more fuss." Mrs. Laristi's face went wooden, Behind her, the small faces of her children watched him, their eyes glittering like rats' eyes in the shadows. Mrs. Laristi shrugged.
"You have seen all. Is there no more to see?"
"Oh, really?" Edward said, regretting his outburst now as a sign of being rattled. "Now listen, Mrs. Laristi. I know there's another room downstairs which you deliberately avoided showing me. The room at the back, opposite side, the long living room. I shan't go until we've seen it. Now come on." He led the way imperiously down the stairs, the beam of his torch a sword blade cutting the gloom aside. He could hear Penny's high heels following, then the multiple trample of the Laristi horde. He strode straight to the door which he knew led to the room Mrs. Laristi had been keeping from him. She jostled furiously in front of him once again and put her revolting hands on his dark, Crombie overcoat, pushing him away from the door.
"Ah, no, no,"
she shrieked.
"It's the evil room. The evil room. You must not go if you feel it. No, Dios, Dios."
To his surprise, Edward saw that she was genuinely terrified now. Her face was as lifeless as dough, her black eyes bright with panic.
"This room is where big evil in the house is living. There is terrible sounds in the room. Always. Maybe old murder there. Maybe many murders, maybe worse. There is terrible things that come out at night to make evil in the house. Oh, Madre de Dios."
"Oh, Teddy," Penny's voice was as thin as water. "Let's leave it and go, please. Please. Surely this one room doesn't matter now when we've seen so many."
"Nonsense!" Edward almost shouted. "Superstitious nonsense! I'm not surprised there's terrible noises with these revolting cats having the run of her place. For God's sake, let's behave like intelligent adults instead of a lot of sniveling savages."
He gripped Penny's arm roughly to bring her to her senses, and then swept Mrs. Laristi and her children aside with the hand in which held his big torch. He pushed at the door, but it was locked. Fortunately, the woman had left the key in the lock. He turned it and flung the door open, pulling Penny firmly inside with him so that the beginning would be over before there was time to think. He almost laughed with the pathos of it when he looked around in the room. It was big and harmless and empty. It was almost cheerful with the moonlight pouring in through the pleasing French windows that gave on to the long garden beyond. Of course, the garden was bound to be a wilderness now, but perhaps some good plants had survived and could be trimmed into shape again. And, unsurprisingly, the glass in the French windows was mostly broken. The only sound was the voices of the Laristis gabbling away at their mumbo-jumbo outside, louder than ever because of her panic. The room was really very nice indeed, with perhaps the best ceiling of all, though the wallpaper was in ruins again. The only odd thing about it was the smell, which was once again very much the same smell as the other adjoining room which he'd been in at the beginning, and which had perplexed him then. He walked forward with Penny across the room, sniffing at the smell, knowing at the back of his mind that there was something important about it, while he played his torch on the intricacies of the ceiling. At that moment, a cat scuttled from a dark corner and out of the broken French window, and the floor cracked and gave way beneath them. Penny's thin, elastic scream coincided with the sensation of their falling, and then unconsciousness came and hit them like a giant fist. Agonizing pain in his legs brought him to. He didn't know how long afterwards. At the same moment, the smell he had been worrying about the moment before the accident leaped forward to reveal itself in his mind. It was the vile smell of the hideous, insidious fungus that swallowed houses alive like a python. It was Merilius Larriman's dry rot. He tried to move, but the pain in his legs leaped, making him scream. He realized his trousers were warm and wet, and that he was already faint from loss of blood. He groped with his hands and found he was laying on heaps of rubble and broken brick. They must have fallen through to some deep foundations beneath the house. Panic at the thought of Penny shot through him. He called her name and groped about in the darkness for her. His hand came in contact with the familiar softness of the cashmere coat. He sobbed with relief and grasped her for comfort in spite of the pain, but she didn't respond. When his fingers found her face, he knew why. Her head was right over, her neck broken. She was dead. Then the sound of the key turning in the lock in the door above somewhere, and the noise of the Laristis gabbling their charms came to him, dimly, showing him that he couldn't have been unconscious for long. He cried out for help, but the pain in the effort turned into a scream. The only answer was increasing gabbling from the Laristis. It dawned on him suddenly that she would take their disappearance merely as the work of the evil she imagined to be in control of the room. Any cries she heard would only confirm in her mind that something awful had happened to them because of it. He knew for certain she'd do nothing about it. His thoughts flew to the estate agent, Faithwell. Surely he'd do something. But there was little hope of anything from an inefficient and listless fellow like that. He'd take the fact that they didn't contact him again as a sign they weren't interested in the house, if he remembered them at all. And it was Friday night. Nobody would miss them until Monday at the earliest, when they'd see he hadn't turned up at the office. Tears sprang to his eyes, tears of fury at Mrs. Laristi and the superstition that was now inevitably going to be the death of him too. He put his head on Penny's sweet-smelling cashmere coat and wept with fury and with weakness through his rapid loss of blood, which he did not know how to stop.